The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly on the McKinnon ranch that August morning. Sarah McKinnon stood on the wraparound porch of the main house, her emerald dress perfectly pressed, watching the dust clouds rising from the cattle pens in the distance. At 22, she had never known hardship, never worked a day in the fields, never questioned the comfort that her father's success had provided. The McKinnon ranch was the largest in 3 counties, and everyone knew it. She was arranging flowers in a crystal vase when she noticed a lone figure walking up the main road. As he drew closer, she could see he was dressed simply, almost poorly, with worn leather pants and a faded shirt. His long dark hair was tied back, and his sun-darkened skin told of days spent under the harsh prairie sun. Something about his appearance made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite place why. The man approached the porch with quiet confidence, removing his hat respectfully. Before he could speak, Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp and dismissive. "If you're looking for handouts, we don't give charity here. The mission is 10 miles east." Her words cut through the air like a whip, and she saw something flicker in his dark eyes, though his expression remained calm. He stood there for a moment, seeming to measure his words carefully, then simply nodded and turned to walk toward the workers' quarters without saying anything. Sarah watched him go, feeling oddly unsettled. She had spoken to many drifters and workers before, but something about this man's quiet dignity bothered her. She shook off the feeling and returned to her flowers, dismissing the encounter from her mind. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, her father, Samuel McKinnon, made an announcement that would shatter her comfortable world. "Sarah, I've made arrangements for your future. There's someone I want you to meet properly tomorrow. His name is James Walking Bear, and he'll be joining our family." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate, but she had no idea that the quiet man she had dismissed that very morning was about to become the center of her entire world. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions. Her father had mentioned marriage arrangements before, but she had always managed to deflect the conversation. She had imagined marrying someone from one of the other wealthy ranching families, perhaps the Thornton boy from the neighboring county, or even a businessman from Kansas City. Anyone but a stranger her father had chosen without consulting her. The next morning, she dressed in her finest riding outfit, determined to make an impression on whoever this James Walking Bear might be. Her father had said he was part Apache, raised by a missionary family after his mother passed away, and had become a successful horse trader and ranch manager. Samuel McKinnon was proud of this match, speaking of James's business acumen and strong character. Sarah listened politely, but inside she was already building walls of resistance. At 10 o'clock, her father called her to the study. Sarah entered with her head held high, ready to politely but firmly decline this arrangement. But when the door opened and she saw who was standing beside her father, her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man from yesterday, the one she had turned away with such cruel words, the one she had assumed was a beggar. James Walking Bear stood tall in clean, well-made clothes, his presence filling the room with quiet strength. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not anger but something worse, disappointment mixed with understanding. Her father, oblivious to their previous encounter, began introducing them warmly. "Sarah, this is James. He owns 3 successful horse ranches across Kansas and Nebraska, and he's agreed to help us expand our operations." Samuel's voice was full of pride and hope. Sarah felt her face burning with shame as the full weight of her mistake crashed down upon her. She had judged this man entirely by his appearance, had treated him with contempt, and now she stood before him as the foolish, privileged girl she had never wanted to be. James extended his hand to her, his expression neutral but his eyes asking a silent question. Would she give him a chance to prove who he really was? Sarah's hand trembled as she reached out to take it, knowing that everything she thought she knew about herself and her world had just been turned upside down. The days following the revelation were the most uncomfortable of Sarah's life. James stayed in the guest house on the property, working closely with her father on plans to integrate their ranching operations. Sarah watched from a distance, torn between her burning shame and a stubborn pride that refused to let her apologize. She noticed how the ranch hands respected James, how he worked alongside them in the corrals, how he could gentle a wild horse with patience and skill that seemed almost magical. One afternoon, her curiosity got the better of her. She walked down to the training pens, where James was working with a particularly difficult stallion that had been causing problems for weeks. The other hand stood back, but James moved slowly, speaking in low tones, his movements deliberate and calm. Within an hour, the horse that had thrown 3 experienced cowboys was eating from his hand. Sarah found herself mesmerized, not just by the skill but by the patience and respect he showed the animal. James noticed her watching and walked over to the fence. For a moment they stood in awkward silence. Finally Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong about you. Terribly wrong." James leaned against the fence post, his expression thoughtful. "You saw what you expected to see. Most people do." His words were simple, without accusation, which somehow made Sarah feel even worse. She wanted him to be angry, to yell at her, to give her something to fight against. Instead, he was giving her understanding she didn't deserve. Over the next several days, Sarah found herself intentionally crossing paths with James, trying to show him she was more than the spoiled girl he had met on the porch. She asked him about his work, about the horses, about his plans for the ranch. James answered her questions patiently, but there was a distance between them now, a wall built by her own words. Her father noticed the tension and pulled her aside one evening. "He's a good man, Sarah. Better than most I've known. But I won't force this if you truly don't want it. I just ask that you give him a fair chance. Judge him by his actions, not by your first impression." That night, Sarah sat on her porch watching the stars, realizing that the real question wasn't whether James was good enough for her, but whether she could become someone worthy of his respect. Tomorrow, she decided, she would truly try to make things right. Sarah woke before dawn with a plan. She dressed in her oldest work clothes, braided her hair simply and headed to the stables. If she wanted James to see her differently, she needed to show him she was willing to step outside her comfortable world. When she arrived at the corrals, James was already there, preparing for the day's work. The surprise on his face when he saw her was worth every uncomfortable feeling churning in her stomach. "I want to learn," she said simply. "About the horses, about the work. If we're going to—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "If we're going to build something together, I need to understand what you do." James studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his eyes. Without a word, he handed her a pair of leather gloves and a lead rope. The work was harder than Sarah had ever imagined. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and the Kansas sun seemed twice as hot as usual. But she didn't complain. She watched James work, learned his techniques, and slowly began to understand the philosophy behind his methods. He never forced the horses, never used fear or pain. Instead, he built trust, established respect, and created partnerships. During their lunch break, sitting in the shade of the barn, James began to share pieces of his story. He spoke of his mother, a skilled weaver and healer who had died when he was young. He talked about the missionary family who had taken him in, taught him to read and write, and helped him navigate between two worlds. He described the years of working on other people's ranches, saving every penny, learning everything he could, until he finally had enough to buy his first piece of land. His story wasn't one of bitterness or anger, but of determination and hope. Sarah found herself sharing too, talking about the loneliness of being the only child, the pressure of her father's expectations, the fear that she had never truly earned anything in her life. For the first time, they talked not as a wealthy rancher's daughter and a potential business partner, but as two people trying to find their way in a complicated world. As the afternoon sun began to lower, James looked at her with genuine warmth. "You did good work today. Real work." It was a simple compliment, but to Sarah, it meant more than all the flattery she had received at fancy parties and social gatherings. She was finally beginning to see what her father had seen in this man, and more importantly, she was beginning to see herself differently too. 3 months had passed since that transformative day in the corrals, and the McKinnon Ranch had become a different place. Sarah now spent her mornings working alongside James and her afternoons learning the business side of ranching from her father. The blisters on her hands had turned to calluses, and the uncertain girl who had stood on the porch that August day had grown into someone stronger and more confident. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday of November, a simple ceremony that would unite not just two people, but two visions for the future of the ranch. Sarah had insisted on a modest celebration, much to the surprise of her father and the local society ladies who had expected a grand affair. She wanted something real, something that reflected who she and James truly were, not the show she might have wanted months before. On the evening before the wedding, Sarah and James sat together on the porch where they had first met, watching the sun paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day?" Sarah asked quietly. James nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "I remember, but that's not who you are now." Sarah turned to him, her eyes serious. "I think it was who I was then. I'm grateful you gave me the chance to become someone better." James took her hand gently. "We all have moments we wish we could change. What matters is what we do after. You didn't just apologize with words, Sarah. You showed up every day, willing to work, willing to learn, willing to change. That takes more courage than most people ever show." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, two people who had found something unexpected, not just partnership, but genuine understanding and respect that had grown into something deeper. The next day, as Sarah walked toward James under the vast Kansas sky, surrounded by ranch hands, neighboring families, and her beaming father, she knew this wasn't just the beginning of a marriage. It was the beginning of a true partnership built on hard work, mutual respect, and the understanding that worth isn't found in wealth or status, but in the strength of character and the willingness to see beyond first impressions. The rancher's daughter had learned the most important lesson of her life, that sometimes the greatest treasures come in unexpected packages, and the best things in life are earned through humility, hard work, and an open heart. As they exchanged vows under the endless prairie sky, Sarah knew that together they would build something remarkable, not just a successful ranch, but a life built on the foundation of respect, understanding, and love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. The first months of marriage brought challenges Sarah had never anticipated. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across the Kansas plains with a fury that tested even the most experienced ranchers. James and Sarah worked side by side, moving cattle to sheltered areas, reinforcing barn structures, and ensuring every animal had adequate protection from the brutal winds and snow. Sarah's hands, now accustomed to hard work, moved with confidence as she helped distribute hay and check on newborn calves. But the weather wasn't their only challenge. Some of the neighboring ranchers, men who had known Sarah since childhood, struggled to accept James as an equal. At the monthly Cattlemen's Association meeting, several older ranchers questioned his methods and subtly challenged his authority. Sarah watched her husband handle each comment with grace and patience, never rising to anger, always responding with facts and quiet confidence. She felt a fierce pride growing inside her, mixed with frustration at the unfairness he faced. One particularly difficult evening, after a contentious meeting where James's proposal for cooperative water management had been dismissed without serious consideration, Sarah found him alone in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the weariness in his eyes. "They're fools," she said angrily. "Your plan would benefit everyone, and they know it." James smiled slightly, stroking the mare's neck. "Change takes time. They'll come around when they see results, not because I argued louder." That night, the mare gave birth to a strong, healthy foal. As they watched the newborn take its first wobbly steps, Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder. "We're building something important here," she said softly. "Not just a ranch, but a new way of doing things. It won't be easy, but it's worth it." James pulled her close, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the sounds of the barn and the warmth of new life, they both understood that their partnership was being tested by fire. The storm outside might be fierce, but together they were proving they could weather anything. As dawn broke the next morning, the sky cleared to reveal a world transformed by snow, beautiful and harsh, much like the new life they were building together. Spring arrived with its own set of trials. The winter had been hard on everyone's. Herds and several smaller ranches were struggling to recover. James proposed something radical at the next association meeting, a cooperative approach where larger ranches would help smaller ones rebuild in exchange for future labor and shared resources. The room erupted in debate. Some called it charity, Others saw it as weakness, and a few recognized it as an opportunity. Sarah stood beside her husband as he presented detailed plans, showing how cooperation would benefit everyone in the long term. She had helped him prepare the figures, learning more about ranch economics in those weeks than she had in her entire life before. Her father Samuel spoke up in support, lending his respected voice to the proposal. Slowly, grudgingly, a few ranchers began to see the wisdom in it. By the end of the meeting, they had commitments from 5 ranches to try the cooperative approach. The real work began immediately. James and Sarah spent their days traveling between ranches, helping to organize work crews, distributing resources, and teaching James's horse training methods to others. Sarah discovered she had a talent for organization and negotiation, skills she had never had the chance to develop in her previous life of social calls and tea parties. She found herself mediating disputes, tracking supplies, and earning the respect of rough cowboys and weathered ranchers who initially had dismissed her as just a pretty face. One afternoon, while helping repair fencing at the struggling Porter Ranch, old Thomas Porter pulled Sarah aside. He was a crusty widower who had initially been the most vocal opponent of James's ideas. "I was wrong about your husband," he admitted gruffly. "And I was wrong about you too. You both got sand, real grit. My place would have gone under this spring without this help." His words, simple and honest, meant more to Sarah than any compliment she had ever received at a fancy ball. By late spring, the results were undeniable. The participating ranches were recovering faster than those who had refused help. Horse breeding was improving across the region, using James's methods. Even the skeptics were beginning to ask questions, wanting to know more about the cooperative system. Sarah and James would return home each evening, exhausted but satisfied, knowing they were creating something that would last beyond their own ranch. They were changing the culture of an entire region, one fence post and one conversation at a time. Summer brought new opportunities and new questions. Sarah discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled both her and James with joy and a touch of nervousness. As her body changed, so did her perspective on everything they were building. This wasn't just about a ranch anymore. It was about creating a legacy, a place where their children could grow up with the best of both worlds that James represented. Sarah began making plans for a school on their property, a place where ranch children from all backgrounds could learn reading, mathematics, and practical skills. She wrote letters to her former teachers in Kansas City, researching curriculums and gathering books. James supported the idea enthusiastically, seeing it as a way to provide opportunities he had been fortunate enough to receive, but that many children in the territory never got. Together, they converted an unused barn into a bright, welcoming classroom space. Her father Samuel watched these developments with pride and growing understanding. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, he spoke candidly. "I chose James because I saw his character and his business sense. But I never imagined how much you would both grow together. You've become the woman I always hoped you'd be, and you've helped this entire community see possibilities they never considered before." His words brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She had spent so much of her life seeking her father's approval, and now she realized she had finally earned it, not through social graces or obedience, but through real work and genuine growth. The school opened in September with 12 students, children of ranch hands and small farmers who had never had access to education before. Sarah taught in the mornings, her pregnancy visible now but not slowing her down. James taught practical skills in the afternoons, showing the children how to work with horses, mend equipment, and understand the land. The classroom became a place where cultural barriers dissolved, where the son of an Apache horse trainer and the daughter of a wealthy rancher taught side by side. As autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, Sarah stood in the doorway of the school watching the children practice their letters. She felt her baby move inside her, a flutter of life that connected past and future. She thought about the person she had been just over a year ago, so certain of her place in the world, so limited by her own prejudices. That girl seemed like a stranger now. The woman she had become understood that real wealth wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in the lives you touched and the future you helped build. As James came to walk her home, his hand finding hers naturally, She knew they had created something far more valuable than a successful ranch. They had built a bridge between worlds, and their child would walk across it with confidence. November brought an unexpected visitor that would test everything James and Sarah had built. A man named Richard Blackwell arrived from back east, representing a large cattle syndicate, interested in buying up Kansas ranches. He was smooth, well-dressed, and carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who believed money could solve any problem. He made generous offers to several ranchers, including the McKinnons, promising modern techniques and guaranteed profits. What concerned James wasn't the business opportunity itself, but Blackwell's attitude toward the cooperative system they had established. He saw it as inefficient, sentimental, and unbusinesslike. At a community meeting, Blackwell made his pitch, painting a picture of progress and prosperity that sounded appealing to ranchers who were still recovering from the hard winter. He also made several comments, seemingly casual but clearly calculated, that questioned whether someone of James's background could truly understand modern business practices. Sarah felt her anger rising as she watched Blackwell's performance, but James remained calm and thoughtful. After Blackwell finished his presentation, James stood to speak. His words were measured and respectful but powerful. He didn't attack Blackwell's proposal directly. Instead, he talked about what they had built together as a community, about relationships that went beyond profit margins, about the value of helping your neighbor knowing they would help you in return. He spoke about legacy and sustainability, about building something that would last for their children and their children's children. The room was silent when James finished. Then Thomas Porter stood up, the old rancher who had once been James's harshest critic. "I listened to fancy talk before and I almost lost my ranch. This past year, working with James and the cooperative, I've not only recovered, but I'm doing better than I have in 5 years. That's not sentiment, that's results. I'm staying with what works." One by one, other ranchers echoed his sentiment. Blackwell's smooth pitch had met the reality of community bonds forged through shared struggle. After the meeting, Blackwell approached Sarah privately, perhaps thinking she might be more sympathetic to his Eastern sophistication. "You could have had a very different life," he said, his tone suggesting she had settled for less. Sarah looked at him with clear, steady eyes. "I have exactly the life I choose, Mr. Blackwell. I'm partnered with a man of true integrity, building something meaningful with people I respect. That's worth more than any amount of money your syndicate could offer." As Blackwell left the territory empty-handed, Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They had faced their first real external threat, and their community had held strong. The bonds they had built were deeper than business transactions. They were built on trust earned through action. December arrived with both celebration and challenge. Sarah gave birth to a healthy daughter during a quiet snowfall, with James holding her hand and her father pacing nervously outside the bedroom. They named her Elena Rose, combining James's mother's name with Sarah's grandmother's, a bridge between heritages. The tiny girl with dark hair and bright eyes seemed to embody all the hope and possibility they had been building toward. But parenthood brought questions neither of them had fully anticipated. In the general store one afternoon, Sarah overheard 2 women whispering about Elena, questioning what kind of life the child would have, caught between 2 worlds. The words stung, reminding Sarah that while much had changed, old prejudices still lingered beneath the surface. She bought her supplies with head held high, but the encounter troubled her deeply. That evening she shared her concerns with James as they watched Elena sleep peacefully in her cradle. James was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the wisdom that had drawn Sarah to him. "Our daughter will face challenges we can't prevent, but she'll also have something precious, 2 rich heritages and parents who will teach her that her worth comes from who she is, not what others think. We're giving her roots in both worlds and the strength to stand tall in either." His words comforted Sarah, but more than that, they strengthened her resolve. The school they had started became even more important now. Sarah returned to teaching as soon as she was able, often with Elena in a basket beside the desk. The children adored the baby, and Elena grew up surrounded by kids from every background, learning from her earliest days that people came in all varieties and all were valuable. James began teaching some of the older students about the Apache relationship with horses and land, sharing stories and wisdom his mother had passed to him. By spring, something remarkable had happened. The school had become a community center, a place where adults gathered in the evenings to share skills and stories. The ranchers' wives started teaching each other their different cooking traditions. The older cowboys shared cattle handling techniques with younger workers. James taught anyone interested about natural horsemanship, while Sarah organized reading circles and practical mathematics classes. What had started as a simple school had become something much larger, a place where the whole community learned that their differences were strengths, not weaknesses. As Sarah watched James show Elena the horses, explaining to their 6-month-old daughter about patience and respect, she realized they weren't just raising a child. They were raising a generation that would see the world differently than the one before. The summer brought prosperity, but also revealed cracks in the cooperative system. 2 of the ranchers who had benefited most from the shared resource program during the spring began arguing over water rights, old tensions resurfacing during a particularly dry season. The dispute threatened to undo everything they had built, as other ranchers began choosing sides based on old loyalties and family connections rather than the cooperative principles they had agreed to follow. James and Sarah found themselves in the difficult position of mediating between men whose pride was as vast as the prairie itself. Sarah spent hours listening to each side's complaints and concerns, taking careful notes and looking for common ground. James focused on practical solutions, surveying the water sources and creating detailed plans for equitable distribution. Together, they organized a community meeting, insisting that everyone involved leave their anger at the door and focus on solving the problem. The meeting was tense. Accusations flew, old grudges surfaced, and for a while it seemed the cooperative would collapse under the weight of human nature. Then something unexpected happened. Young Michael Porter, Thomas Porter's teenage son and one of the first students from the school, stood up. He had done his own calculations, applying the mathematics Sarah had taught him, and he presented a solution that neither adult faction had considered. His plan would require some sacrifice from both sides, but would ensure enough water for everyone's needs. The room fell silent as the adults absorbed the fact that a 16-year-old boy had found the answer they had been too stubborn to see. Thomas Porter cleared his throat gruffly. "My boy learned that kind of thinking at your school, Sarah. Maybe we should start using our heads like you've been teaching our kids to do." Slowly, grudgingly, the ranchers agreed to implement Michael's plan. It wasn't perfect, and it required compromise, but it worked. That night, as Sarah nursed Elena and listened to James play a soft melody on the guitar he had learned from his mother, she reflected on what had really happened. They hadn't solved the water dispute themselves. They had created an environment where the next generation could solve it better than they could. That was the real success. The school, the cooperative, the bridges they had built between people, all of it was bearing fruit in ways they hadn't anticipated. The foundation they had laid was strong enough that others were now building on it. As she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, Sarah felt confident that Elena would grow up in a community that valued cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, and wisdom over tradition, for tradition's sake. 2 years had passed since that first encounter on the porch, and the McKinnon Walking Bear Ranch had become a model for the entire territory. Visitors came from as far as Colorado and Nebraska to learn about their cooperative system and natural horsemanship methods. The school now had 25 students and 2 additional teachers. The community they had built had weathered drought, economic challenges, and the inevitable human conflicts that arise when people work closely together. Sarah stood on the same porch where she had once turned James away, watching Elena take determined toddler steps across the yard while James walked patiently beside her. Her father Samuel, now retired and helping with the school, sat in his rocking chair nearby, a contented smile on his weathered face. The ranch had expanded, but more importantly, it had become a place where anyone with genuine desire to work and learn was welcome. Regardless of background, a wagon approached on the main road, and Sarah felt a familiar flutter of curiosity. A young man climbed down, his clothes travel-worn, his expression uncertain. He approached the porch nervously, clearly expecting to be turned away. "I heard this was a place that gives people chances," he said quietly. "I've made mistakes, but I want to learn, want to do better." Is there work here for someone willing to start at the bottom? Sarah looked at him carefully, seeing in his hopeful face an echo of countless people who had come to their ranch seeking opportunity. She thought about the woman she used to be, so quick to judge, so certain of her superiority. She thought about James's patience with her, his willingness to see potential beneath a flawed surface. She thought about all the people who had surprised her over the past 2 years, revealing depth and capability she would have missed if she had trusted only first impressions. She smiled warmly at the young man. We believe in second chances here. Let me introduce you to my husband. He'll get you started in the stables and we'll see what you're made of. As the young man followed James toward the corrals, Sarah picked up Elena and held her close. Her daughter babbled happily, reaching for her mother's face with chubby hands. One day, Sarah whispered to her daughter, I'll tell you about the day I almost missed out on the most important thing in my life because I judged by appearances instead of character. I'll teach you what your father taught me, that real worth is earned through actions, that pride can blind us to truth, and that the greatest adventures often begin with humility and an open heart. The Kansas sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors. From the corrals came the sound of James's patient voice as he began teaching the new arrival about horses and respect. From the schoolhouse came the laughter of children finishing their afternoon lessons. From the fields came the calls of ranch hands, finishing their work for the day. Sarah breathed deeply, taking in the scene, knowing that this was what true success looked like. Not perfection, but progress. Not wealth alone, but purpose. Not exclusion, but community built on mutual respect and shared effort. As Eleanor nestled into her arms, Sarah knew that the story that had begun with her worst moment had transformed into their greatest triumph. They had built something that would outlast them, a legacy not of land or money, but of changed hearts and expanded possibilities. The rancher's daughter, who had once stood on this porch with narrow vision and a cold heart, had become a woman who saw clearly, loved deeply, and understood that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The sun set on another day at the McKinnon Walking Bear Ranch, and as the first stars appeared in the vast Kansas sky, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to live up to the lessons she and James had learned together. The story that had begun with judgment and pride had become one of grace and growth, and it was far from over.